May 7, 1945. The war in Europe had mere hours left before its official end, but in a dense forest outside the shattered German town of Berchtesgaden, the fighting still felt very real. Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Milwaukee crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his Thompson submachine gun trained on the tree line ahead. His company had been advancing through Bavaria for weeks, encountering scattered resistance from Wehrmacht units that refused to accept the inevitable. The spring morning was unseasonably cold, and a thin mist clung to the ground between the trees. O'Brien could hear his own breathing, steady and controlled, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Somewhere in the forest ahead, German soldiers were hiding, and his orders were to secure the area before nightfall. What happened next would haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. From behind a cluster of pine trees, a white cloth appeared, waving frantically on the end of a rifle barrel. O'Brien signaled to his men to hold their fire, watching carefully for any sign of a trap. The Germans had used false surrenders before, and every American soldier had learned to approach such moments with extreme caution. But as figures began emerging from the forest, O'Brien felt his stomach tighten with an emotion he hadn't expected. They weren't men, they were children. 12 boys stumbled out of the tree line with their hands raised above their heads. Their Wehrmacht uniforms hung loosely on thin frames, clearly sized for adults and hastily altered to fit smaller bodies. The oldest might have been 16. The youngest looked barely 12 years old, his face still round with the last remnants of childhood. Their eyes were wide with terror, and several were visibly shaking. One boy near the back was crying silently, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on his face. They moved in a tight cluster, as if proximity to each other might offer some protection against what they clearly believed was coming. Private First Class Tommy Chen, whose family had immigrated from Guangdong when he was young, lowered his rifle and turned to O'Brien with disbelief written across his face. "Sarge, they're just kids," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. O'Brien nodded slowly, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. These weren't hardened SS fanatics or experienced Wehrmacht soldiers. They were children that Nazi Germany had conscripted in its desperate final months, throwing them into a war that was already lost. The boys stood in ragged formation, their hands still raised, waiting for the execution they had been promised by their commanders. Nazi propaganda had filled their heads with stories of American brutality, of soldiers who showed no mercy to prisoners, who tortured and killed anyone who surrendered. The oldest boy, a thin teenager with hollow cheeks and blue eyes that had seen far too much, stood slightly ahead of the others. His voice was steady despite his fear as he spoke in heavily accented English, words he had clearly memorized for this moment. "We surrender. Please, the young ones. They are only children." Sergeant O'Brien slowly stood up from behind the fallen oak, keeping his weapon lowered but ready. He raised one hand in what he hoped was a calming gesture, the way he might approach a frightened animal. The 12 boys flinched at his movement, and the youngest one let out a small whimper of fear. O'Brien took 3 careful steps forward, close enough now to see the details that made this moment even more heartbreaking. Several of the boys wore boots that were falling apart, tied together with scavenged wire and strips of cloth. Their uniforms were filthy, stained with mud and what appeared to be dried blood. One boy had a bandage wrapped around his left hand, the cloth yellowed with infection. Another had a nasty bruise spreading across his cheek, purple and green against pale skin. The oldest boy who had spoken stepped forward again, positioning himself between O'Brien and the younger children. There was something protective in his stance, despite his own obvious terror. He couldn't have weighed more than 120 pounds, but he stood as straight as he could manage, trying to maintain some dignity in what he believed were his final moments. His German uniform jacket had corporal stripes hastily sewn onto the sleeves, a rank that seemed absurd on someone so young. Behind O'Brien, his squad had emerged from their positions, 8 American soldiers forming a loose semicircle around the surrendering children. Private Chen had slung his rifle over his shoulder, unwilling to point it at boys who reminded him of his younger cousins back in San Francisco. Corporal James Washington from Alabama, who had seen his share of combat since Normandy, removed his helmet and ran a hand over his close-cropped hair. He exchanged a long look with O'Brien, and in that glance passed an entire conversation about the madness of war that would send children to fight grown men. The German boys watched every movement with the intensity of prey animals, their bodies tensed to run despite having nowhere to go. The crying boy had pressed himself against the shoulder of another child, seeking comfort in what he assumed were his last moments alive. His sobs were quiet but persistent, a sound that cut through the morning air more effectively than any gunfire. O'Brien cleared his throat and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage, though he doubted many of them understood English beyond basic commands. "Nobody's going to hurt you," he said slowly, enunciating each word. "You're prisoners of war now. You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention." The oldest boy translated in rapid German to the others, but the fear in their eyes didn't diminish. They had been told that Americans made promises before executing prisoners, that this was how the enemy played with their victims. One boy near the middle of the group had closed his eyes tightly, his lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. Private First Class Robert Martinez had served as a medic since landing at Anzio, and he had developed an instinct for spotting injuries that needed immediate attention. As he approached the group of terrified children, his trained eye caught something that overrode every other concern. The youngest boy, the one who looked barely 12 years old, was swaying slightly on his feet. His face was flushed despite the cool morning air, and there was a glassy quality to his eyes that Martinez recognized immediately as fever. The child's left leg appeared to be favoring his right, and a dark stain on his trouser leg suggested a wound that had been bleeding for some time. Martinez moved slowly, keeping his Red Cross armband visible as he approached. The boy watched him come closer with the frozen terror of a rabbit facing a fox. When Martinez knelt down to the child's level, speaking gently in broken German he had picked up during the campaign, the boy actually tried to back away. He stumbled, and Martinez caught him by the shoulders to prevent him from falling. The child's body was burning with fever, the heat radiating through his thin uniform jacket. Martinez could feel the boy trembling under his hands, every muscle rigid with fear. The other German children moved instinctively to help their companion, but the oldest boy held them back with a sharp command, clearly believing that any sudden movement might trigger violence from their captors. Martinez ignored the politics and focused on what he knew how to do. He carefully rolled up the boy's pant leg, revealing a deep gash across his calf that had been badly bandaged with strips of dirty cloth. The wound was infected, red and swollen, with the telltale streaks that indicated the infection was spreading. Without proper treatment, the child could lose his leg or worse. The boy whimpered when Martinez examined the wound, biting his lip to keep from crying out. He expected pain, expected cruelty, expected everything except what happened next. Martinez reached into his medical bag and pulled out sulfa powder and clean bandages, speaking in a soothing tone that transcended language barriers. He had treated wounded German soldiers before, but there was something particularly obscene about this child, having been sent into combat in this condition. As Martinez cleaned and dressed the wound with gentle efficiency, he felt the boy's rigid muscles begin to relax slightly. The other children watched with confusion, replacing some of their terror. This wasn't what they had been told would happen. Enemy soldiers weren't supposed to help them, weren't supposed to waste valuable medical supplies on defeated German prisoners, especially not on children who had been fighting against them just hours earlier. Sergeant O'Brien watched the scene unfold and felt something shift in the morning air. His men were lowering their weapons completely now, no longer seeing enemies, but seeing what they actually were. Terrified, wounded, starving children who had been failed by every adult who should have protected them. Sergeant Michael O'Brien stood watching Private Martinez finish bandaging the youngest boy's infected leg, and something in the scene triggered a memory so vivid it nearly knocked the breath out of him. His sister's twins back in Milwaukee, Bobby and Danny, were around the same age as some of these German children. He had photographs of them in his wallet, taken just before he shipped out, showing two gap-toothed boys grinning at the camera in their Little League uniforms. The contrast between those carefree American children and these hollow-eyed German boys in Wehrmacht uniforms created a cognitive dissonance that physically hurt. These children should have been playing baseball or doing homework or sneaking comic books under their blankets at night, not fighting in a war that had already been lost before they were even conscripted. O'Brien turned to Corporal Washington and spoke quietly, aware that his decision might raise eyebrows among the brass if they ever found out. "James, go back to the supply truck and bring up whatever rations we've got. The good stuff, not just K rations. These kids look like they haven't eaten properly in weeks." Washington nodded without hesitation and jogged back toward their position, understanding perfectly what his sergeant was trying to do. The other American soldiers had begun to relax their defensive postures, some sitting down on fallen logs or leaning against trees, transforming the tense standoff into something that resembled a peculiar gathering rather than a military operation. Private Tommy Chen had pulled out a Hershey bar from his pocket and was trying to offer it to one of the middle-aged German boys, a gangly teenager with red hair and freckles who stared at the chocolate as if it might be poisoned. Chen broke off a piece and ate it himself, then offered the rest again with an encouraging smile. The German boy looked to his older companion for permission, received a cautious nod, and accepted the chocolate with trembling fingers. The moment he tasted it, his eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been the first hint of pleasure these children had experienced in months. When Washington returned 15 minutes later, he was carrying a crate that made O'Brien smile despite the gravity of their situation. The supply sergeant at battalion headquarters had a strange obsession with procuring unusual items for the troops, and among the standard rations were several dozen bottles of root beer extract and condensed milk that he had somehow acquired. O'Brien had grown up working in his uncle's ice cream parlor every summer, and he knew exactly what to do with those ingredients. He turned to Private Chen with instructions that must have seemed bizarre given their circumstances. "Tommy, find me some clean canteen cups and see if there's any ice left in the medical cooler. We're going to make these kids something they've never tasted before." For the next 20 minutes, American soldiers who had been fighting through Germany for months became impromptu soda jerks, mixing root beer floats with the precision of short-order cooks. They used melted ice cream powder from their rations, root beer extract mixed with cold water from a nearby stream, and whatever creativity they could muster. The German boys watched this strange activity with complete bewilderment, unable to reconcile their expectations of execution with the surreal reality of their enemies preparing drinks for them. The oldest German boy asked in halting English what was happening, and O'Brien replied with a grin that surprised even himself. "You boys ever had an American root beer float? Well, you're about to find out what you've been missing." The 12 German boys stood in an awkward cluster, watching as American soldiers finished preparing what looked like foaming beverages in metal canteen cups. The drinks were a pale brown color, topped with something white and creamy that fizzed and bubbled at the surface. To children who had survived on watery soup and stale bread for months, who had been taught that Americans were barbaric enemies devoid of mercy or humanity, this scene made absolutely no sense. The youngest boy, whose fever had begun to subside slightly thanks to Martinez's sulfa powder and clean bandages, leaned heavily against the oldest boy's shoulder, exhausted and confused by everything happening around him. The red-haired teenager who had accepted Tommy Chen's chocolate whispered urgently in German to his companions. His words were tinged with suspicion and fear, suggesting that this must be some elaborate psychological torture before their execution, or perhaps the drinks were poisoned to make their deaths less troublesome for the Americans to deal with. Another boy, who couldn't have been more than 13 with a shock of blonde hair and anxious gray eyes, suggested that maybe the Americans were fattening them up before sending them to prison camps, where they would be used for hard labor. Their imaginations, fed by years of Nazi propaganda about enemy cruelty, couldn't comprehend the simple possibility that these American soldiers might actually be showing them genuine kindness. Sergeant O'Brien approached the group carrying 2 of the improvised root beer floats, the foam still bubbling at the rim of the canteen cups. He handed one to the oldest German boy, the self-appointed protector of the group, and gestured for him to drink. The teenager took the cup with both hands, staring down at the strange concoction, as if it might explode at any moment. He looked back at his companions, then at the American soldiers who were watching with expressions that seemed more anticipatory than threatening. Private Chen mimed drinking from his own cup of water, making exaggerated gestures of enjoyment, trying to communicate that the beverage was safe and meant to be consumed. The German boys huddled closer together, engaging in rapid, whispered debate about what they should do. Their voices carried the distinctive cadence of fear mixed with desperate hunger. They were starving, their bodies craving sustenance after weeks of inadequate rations and constant movement through hostile territory. But they had been conditioned to expect treachery from their enemies at every turn. One boy suggested they should refuse, maintaining their dignity as German soldiers even in captivity. Another argued that if the Americans wanted them dead, they would already be dead, so perhaps this strange drink was actually safe to consume. The youngest boy, emboldened perhaps by his fever or by the unexpected gentleness of the American medic who had treated his wound, reached out tentatively toward one of the cups that Private Martinez was holding. His small hand was filthy, the fingernails broken and caked with dirt from digging foxholes and crawling through forests. Martinez lowered the cup to the child's level, speaking soft words in his broken German that approximated reassurance and safety. The boy's fingers wrapped around the metal cup, feeling its coolness against his palm. He brought it close to his face, sniffing cautiously at the sweet, unfamiliar aroma that rose from the foaming surface. His companions watched with held breath, waiting to see if their youngest member would be brave enough or foolish enough to take the first sip of whatever this strange American concoction might be. The youngest boy lifted the metal canteen cup to his cracked lips with both hands, his fingers trembling from a combination of fever, fear, and hunger. The other 11 German children watched him with the intensity of witnesses to a potentially fatal decision. Private Martinez knelt beside the child, maintaining a gentle presence that communicated safety even as the boy's companions expected poison or trickery. The first sip was tentative, barely wetting the child's lips with the sweet carbonated liquid. His eyes widened immediately, and for a suspended moment, no one in the forest clearing moved or breathed. Then the boy took a longer drink, and his expression transformed completely. The fear didn't vanish entirely, but it was suddenly competing with wonder and surprise and the pure, uncomplicated pleasure of tasting something delicious when you had been starving for weeks. The sweetness of the improvised ice cream mixed with the distinctive flavor of root beer, creating a taste unlike anything these German children had ever experienced. The youngest boy lowered the cup and looked up at Martinez with confusion written across his flushed face, as if trying to reconcile the kindness of this gift with everything he had been taught about American cruelty. The oldest boy, watching his young companion's reaction, carefully, finally brought his own cup to his lips. He drank slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving the American soldiers who surrounded them. When he lowered his cup, there was foam on his upper lip, and despite his obvious effort to maintain dignity and composure, a small sound escaped him that might have been the beginning of something like relief. He spoke rapidly in German to the other children, and while the American soldiers couldn't understand his exact words, the meaning was clear enough. It's safe. It's actually safe. What happened next was like watching a dam break. The other 10 boys crowded forward, suddenly eager for their own cups of the strange American drink. Corporal Washington, Private Chen, and the other soldiers moved among them, distributing the root beer floats with the care of men who understood the significance of this moment. Some boys gulped their drinks desperately, months of hunger overriding any remaining caution. Others sipped slowly, savoring each mouthful as if it might be their last taste of kindness. The red-haired teenager drank his entire cup in what seemed like 3 long swallows, then stared at the empty container with something approaching grief that it was gone. Sergeant O'Brien watched the transformation with a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with combat stress. These were the enemies he had been fighting for months, soldiers wearing Wehrmacht uniforms who had been shooting at American troops just hours before. But they were also children, and watching them experience joy for perhaps the first time in months reminded him of why he had joined this war in the first place. It wasn't just about defeating armies or capturing territory. It was about defeating the ideology that would send children to die in hopeless battles and proving that the American way of treating even enemies with basic human dignity was worth fighting for. As the initial shock of the root beer floats began to fade, replaced by the warm fullness of having something substantial in their stomachs, for the first time in days, the German boys began to relax in small, almost imperceptible ways. Their shoulders dropped slightly from their defensive hunches. Their eyes, while still wary, no longer held the absolute terror of imminent execution. The youngest boy had fallen asleep against Private Martinez's shoulder, his fever-warm body finally surrendering to exhaustion now that he felt safe enough to let his guard down. Martinez sat very still, unwilling to disturb the child's rest, one hand resting protectively on the boy's back. Sergeant O'Brien settled himself on a fallen log and gestured for the oldest German boy to sit beside him. The teenager hesitated, then complied, maintaining a careful distance but no longer rigid with fear. Through a combination of the boy's broken English, O'Brien's handful of German phrases, and elaborate hand gestures, they began to communicate. The oldest boy's name was Klaus Zimmermann, and he was 16 years old, though the war had aged him far beyond those years. He had been conscripted 4 months earlier from his home in Bavaria, pulled from his family's farm, where he had been helping his mother and sisters manage the land after his father died at Stalingrad 3 years before. The other boys had similar stories that emerged piece by piece as American soldiers sat among them, sharing cigarettes with the older teenagers and candy bars with the younger ones. The red-haired boy was Friedrich, 14 years old, an orphan whose parents had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Frankfurt. He had been living on the streets when the Wehrmacht conscripted him, seeing military service as preferable to starvation. The blond boy with gray eyes was Wilhelm, 13, who had been separated from his family during the chaos of the Eastern Front's collapse. He had been trying to reach his grandmother's house in Munich when he was picked up by a retreating Wehrmacht unit and pressed into service. Each story was a small tragedy, a window into how Nazi Germany's final desperation had consumed its own children. Private Chen sat with a boy named Otto, who was 15, and had been training as an apprentice carpenter before the war found him. Corporal Washington listened to Hans, a quiet 14-year-old who had been in the Hitler Youth and believed every word of Nazi propaganda until he saw his commanding officers abandon their posts and flee, leaving the children to face advancing American forces alone. The stories painted a picture of a generation sacrificed by adults who should have protected them. What struck the American soldiers most powerfully was the absence of fanaticism in these children. They weren't dedicated Nazis willing to die for Hitler's Reich. They were scared, confused boys who had been caught up in something far larger than themselves, who had fought because they had no choice, and who had surrendered because they were too tired and hungry and frightened to do anything else. Some had been in uniform for only a few weeks. Others had survived months of retreat across Germany, watching their country crumble around them while being told that victory was still possible. While the German children dozed or talked quietly among themselves, Having been given more K rations and canteens of clean water, Sergeant O'Brien called his men together out of earshot for a conversation that needed to happen. The 8 American soldiers gathered in a tight circle, their faces reflecting a complex mixture of emotions that had been building since the moment those 12 boys emerged from the forest with their hands raised. Private Chen spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. He wasn't angry at the children, but at the system that had put them in Wehrmacht uniforms and sent them to fight grown men with real combat experience. Corporal Washington, who had landed at Normandy on D-Day +2 and had seen more combat than he cared to remember, sat with his head in his hands. He had killed German soldiers during the advance through France and into Germany. He had done so without hesitation because they were enemies trying to kill him and his brothers in arms. But looking at those 12 exhausted children had forced him to confront an uncomfortable question. How many of the German soldiers he had killed over the past 11 months had been barely older than these boys? How many had been teenagers conscripted against their will, fighting for a cause they didn't understand or believe in? Private Martinez, still sitting with the sleeping youngest boy against his shoulder, spoke quietly about the rage he felt toward the German high command and the Nazi leadership who had brought their country to this point. He had treated wounded German prisoners before, had maintained his professional detachment and his commitment to the Hippocratic principles that guided his work as a medic. But treating a 12-year-old child's infected combat wound was different. The boy should have been in school, not bleeding in a forest while fighting a war that had already been lost before he even put on a uniform. Sergeant O'Brien let his men talk through their feelings, understanding that they needed to process what they were experiencing. Some expressed guilt about the German soldiers they had killed, wondering now if those enemies had also been conscripted children. Others talked about their own younger siblings back home, drawing painful parallels between their baby brothers and these German boys. Private Tommy Chen's voice cracked when he admitted that the red-haired German boy, Friedrich, reminded him so much of his cousin James that it physically hurt to look at him. The cousin who was safe in San Francisco, who would never have to know what it felt like to be sent into combat at 14 years old. The conversation eventually turned to what they should do next. Protocol was clear. Enemy prisoners of war were to be disarmed, documented, and transferred to the nearest POW processing center where they would be held until repatriation procedures could be arranged. But protocol hadn't anticipated 12 child soldiers who had been shown kindness instead of the execution they expected. O'Brien made a decision that could potentially end his military career if the wrong superior officer decided to make an issue of it. They would keep the boys with their unit for now, treat them as wards rather than prisoners, and worry about the paperwork later. Over the following 3 days, something remarkable happened in that forest clearing outside Berchtesgaden. As official news of Germany's unconditional surrender spread through the region, the war that had consumed Europe for 6 years finally ended. But for Sergeant O'Brien's squad and their 12 German charges, the end of hostilities meant the beginning of something unprecedented. The American soldiers established a temporary camp in a relatively sheltered area, setting up tents and organizing a perimeter that felt more protective than restrictive. The German boys were given proper bedrolls, clean uniforms from supply stores, and 3 meals a day that represented more food than they had seen in months. The youngest boy, whose name they learned was Joseph, recovered quickly under Martinez's continued care. His infection responded to the sulfa powder and regular cleaning, and his fever broke on the 2nd day. He remained quiet and watchful, staying close to Martinez whenever possible, as if the medic represented the only source of safety in an uncertain world. Martinez found himself adopting a protective role he had never anticipated, checking Joseph's wound multiple times daily and making sure the child ate enough at every meal. The other soldiers teased him gently about becoming a mother hen, but Martinez didn't care. Klaus Zimmermann, The 16-year-old who had appointed himself leader of the German boys began serving as an official translator and intermediary. His English improved dramatically through constant practice, and he helped bridge the cultural and linguistic gaps that still existed. He translated not just words, but intentions, helping his younger companions understand that these American soldiers genuinely meant them no harm. Klaus had begun keeping a journal, borrowed paper and pencil from Corporal Washington, and he wrote down everything that happened each day as if he needed concrete proof that this unexpected kindness was real. The American soldiers fell naturally into roles that mirrored family dynamics. Private Chen, who had 3 younger brothers back home, organized games and activities to keep the younger German boys occupied and distracted from their uncertain futures. He taught them basic English through simple songs and hand games, and in return, they taught him German phrases that made communication easier. Friedrich, the red-haired orphan, attached himself to Chen with the devotion of a puppy, following him everywhere and hanging on his every word. Corporal Washington took responsibility for the older boys, engaging them in conversations about what they wanted to do after the war. He talked about his plans to attend college on the GI Bill, about building a life beyond military service, about the possibilities that peace would bring. Hans, the former Hitler Youth member, listened with fascination to Washington's descriptions of American education and opportunity, comparing them to the rigid limitations of the Nazi system he had grown up in. The contrast was striking, and Hans began asking questions that suggested his indoctrination was crumbling under the weight of lived experience. Sergeant O'Brien coordinated everything, managing supplies and deflecting questions from passing officers about why his squad had acquired 12 German children who seemed to be living more like guests than prisoners. On the 5th day of their unusual arrangement, a Red Cross worker named Eleanor Hartley arrived at the camp with a canvas bag full of mail and a stack of official-looking documents. She was a stern woman in her late 40s who had been working with displaced persons and prisoners throughout the European theater. Her initial expression of disapproval at finding German children living comfortably among American soldiers softened considerably when she saw how the boys were being treated. Klaus approached her tentatively, asking in careful English if she could help them locate their families or at least discover what had happened to their homes. Mrs. Hartley set up a makeshift office in one of the tents and spent 6 hours interviewing each boy individually, recording their full names, birth dates, last known addresses of family members, and any other information that might help trace their loved ones. The process was emotionally grueling for everyone involved. Some boys broke down completely when forced to confront the possibility that they might be orphans. Others maintained stoic composure while providing details about parents, siblings, and homes that might no longer exist. The American soldiers stayed close by, offering quiet support and comfort when the interviews became too painful. What Mrs. Hartley discovered painted a devastating picture. Friedrich's status as an orphan was already confirmed. His parents had been killed 8 months earlier, and he had no other living relatives that he knew of. Wilhelm's grandmother's house in Munich had been completely destroyed in a bombing raid in February. No one knew if the old woman had survived or where she might have gone if she had. Otto's family farm had been in the path of the Soviet advance from the east, and there was no current information about what had happened to his parents and 3 sisters. Klaus received perhaps the most bittersweet news. His mother and 2 sisters were alive, living in a displaced persons camp near Stuttgart. They had been forced to flee their farm when fighting reached their region, and they were now waiting for permission to return home, assuming there was still a home to return to. The relief on Klaus's face at learning his family had survived was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a new complexity. If he could reunite with his family, what would that mean? Would he be separated from the American soldiers who had shown him kindness? Would he have to leave behind the younger boys who depended on his leadership and translation skills? Joseph's situation was perhaps the most heartbreaking. The youngest of the group had been separated from his family during the chaotic evacuation of a town near the Czech border. He knew his parents' names and his home address, but he had no idea if they had survived or where they might be. Mrs. Hartley promised to file inquiries through official channels, but she was honest about the challenges. Millions of people were displaced, records were destroyed, and it might take months or even years to locate anyone. Mrs. Hartley didn't just bring news about families. She also brought newspapers, official reports, and photographs from the concentration camps that Allied forces had been liberating across Germany and Poland. She believed, despite the pain it would cause, that these boys needed to understand the full truth about what their country had done. Sergeant O'Brien initially objected, wanting to protect the children from such horrific knowledge, but Mrs. Hartley was firm in her conviction. These boys would have to live in a post-war world that would judge Germany for its crimes, and they deserved to understand why. She gathered all 12 boys in the largest tent and, with Klaus translating when necessary, began to explain what the Allies had discovered. She started with factual, clinical descriptions of the concentration camp system, the systematic murder of millions of Jews, Roma, disabled persons, political prisoners, and other groups deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. The boys listened with growing confusion and disbelief. This wasn't what they had been taught. The propaganda had told them that Germany was defending itself against enemies, that the war was about survival and honor and protecting their homeland. Then, Mrs. Hartley showed them the photographs. Images from Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, pictures of mass graves, of emaciated prisoners, of children not much younger than themselves who had been systematically starved and worked to death. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Several boys began crying, others sat in shocked silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Friedrich ran out of the tent and vomited in the bushes, his body rejecting the horror of what his eyes had witnessed. Wilhelm kept repeating in German that it couldn't be real, that these pictures must be fake propaganda created by the Allies to make Germany look evil. Klaus sat frozen, staring at a photograph of children behind barbed wire at Auschwitz. His hands were shaking so badly that he had to set the picture down. He looked up at Mrs. Hartley with tears streaming down his face and asked in a broken voice if ordinary Germans really didn't know this was happening. She explained gently that many Germans claimed ignorance, that the camps were hidden from most of the population, but that there had been signs that people chose not to see. The disappearance of Jewish neighbors, the rumors that circulated, the smoke from crematoriums that people pretended not to smell. Hans, the former Hitler Youth member, seemed to age 10 years in that single afternoon. Everything he had been taught, every belief he had held about the righteousness of Germany's cause crumbled into dust. He had genuinely believed he was serving a noble purpose, defending his homeland against enemies who wanted to destroy German culture. Now he understood that he had been indoctrinated into supporting a regime responsible for industrial-scale murder. The revelation about the concentration camps created a profound shift in the German boys that manifested over the following week. The initial shock gave way to a deeper, more complicated grief that combined shame, anger, confusion, and a desperate need to somehow make amends for crimes they hadn't personally committed but felt connected to nonetheless. The American soldiers watched this transformation with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty, unsure how to help children process such overwhelming moral complexity. Private Martinez found Joseph crying quietly one night, and when he asked what was wrong, the 12-year-old whispered that he was sorry for what Germany had done, even though he hadn't known about it. In response to their guilt and confusion, the boys began throwing themselves into helping around the camp with an intensity that went beyond simple cooperation. They weren't just following orders or trying to stay busy, they were searching for redemption through action, for some way to prove that they could be better than the system that had failed them so catastrophically. Klaus organized the younger boys into work details, approaching Sergeant O'Brien each morning to ask what tasks needed completing. They cleaned equipment, organized supplies, helped with cooking, and volunteered for any job that would make them useful rather than simply dependent on American charity. Friedrich discovered an aptitude for mechanical work when he helped Private Chen repair a Jeep that had broken down. His careful attention to detail and natural curiosity about how things functioned made him an asset in maintaining the squad's vehicles and equipment. Chen began teaching him more advanced mechanical skills, and Friedrich absorbed the knowledge with the eagerness of someone discovering a purpose beyond mere survival. He talked about wanting to become an engineer someday, to build things instead of destroying them, to create something positive that might balance out the destruction his country had caused. Wilhelm found his niche working alongside Corporal Washington in organizing the camp's supply system. His orderly mind and methodical approach to categorizing materials impressed Washington, who had been struggling to maintain proper inventory records. Together, they developed a system that tracked everything from ammunition to medical supplies, and Wilhelm's careful handwriting filled logbooks with precise notations. The work gave him structure and purpose, replacing the rigid discipline of military service with something that felt productive rather than destructive. Otto, the former carpenter's apprentice, began repairing and improving the physical infrastructure of the camp. He crafted better tent stakes from scavenged wood, built shelves for equipment storage, and even constructed a simple table and benches for meals. His hands, which had held weapons just weeks earlier, now created useful objects with a skill that spoke to his pre-war training. Sergeant O'Brien watched Otto work one afternoon and commented that the world would need builders in peacetime, that skills like his would be essential in reconstructing Europe from the rubble. The transformation wasn't just practical. The boys began engaging in conversations that revealed deeper moral reasoning developing beneath their young exteriors. Hans started asking questions about democracy, about how American government worked, about the principles that separated American society from Nazi ideology. As summer approached and the temporary nature of their situation became increasingly apparent, the question that everyone had been avoiding finally demanded attention. What would happen to these 12 German boys when the war's administrative machinery caught up with them? Sergeant O'Brien had managed to delay official processing through a combination of bureaucratic maneuvering and the general chaos of the immediate post-war period, but he knew his luck couldn't last forever. Orders would eventually come requiring him to transfer the boys to a proper prisoner of war camp or displaced persons facility where they would be processed for repatriation to Germany. The prospect of separation created anxiety throughout the makeshift family they had become. Joseph had nightmares about being sent back to Germany alone, about searching through rubble for parents who might be dead. He woke up crying several times, and Martinez would sit with him until dawn, speaking softly about possibilities and hope, while privately wondering how any of these children would survive being thrust back into a destroyed country with no support system. The youngest boy had become so attached to the American medic that he followed him everywhere, as if proximity might somehow prevent the inevitable separation. Klaus faced perhaps the most complicated decision. He knew his mother and sisters were alive and waiting in a displaced persons camp. Family loyalty demanded that he return to them, to help them rebuild whatever life might be possible in post-war Germany. But he had also become essential to the younger boys who depended on his leadership and translation abilities. More than that, he had discovered possibilities in his interactions with the Americans that Germany had never offered him: education, opportunity, the chance to become something beyond what the Nazi system had prescribed for him based on his social class and background. One evening, Klaus approached Sergeant O'Brien with a question that had been haunting him for weeks. Speaking in the fluent English he had developed, he asked if it would be possible for some of them to stay in America instead of returning to Germany. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. O'Brien explained honestly that he didn't know. The legal framework for such a thing was unclear. These boys were technically enemy prisoners of war, and international agreements required their repatriation. But they were also children, and surely there must be some provision for orphans or displaced minors who had no homes to return to. The conversation sparked intense discussions among all 12 boys. Friedrich, who had no family waiting for him in Germany, desperately wanted the possibility of staying. Wilhelm, whose grandmother was missing and possibly dead, felt torn between the obligation to search for her and the fear of returning to a country where he would be completely alone if he couldn't find her. Otto worried about his family in the Soviet-occupied zone, wondering if searching for them might be more dangerous than staying where he was safe. Hans struggled with guilt about wanting to abandon Germany when his country needed rebuilding versus his growing conviction that America represented values he wanted to embrace. The younger boys looked to Klaus for guidance, but he had no answers to give them. The resolution to their dilemma came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, the Red Cross worker who had helped trace their families, returned to the camp 6 weeks after her initial visit with news that would change everything. She had been corresponding with officials in Washington and Geneva, arguing that these 12 boys represented a unique case that demanded creative solutions. They weren't hardened Nazi soldiers requiring denazification. They were children who had been conscripted against their will, who had demonstrated genuine remorse and transformation, and who faced uncertain and potentially dangerous futures if simply returned to a devastated Germany. Her advocacy had resulted in the creation of an experimental program that would allow qualified German minors to be sponsored for immigration to the United States if American families were willing to take responsibility for them. The program had strict requirements. Sponsors had to prove financial stability, provide suitable housing, ensure the children received education, and commit to helping them integrate into American society. The children would be monitored by social workers and would need to demonstrate good behavior and genuine effort to become productive members of their communities. It was an unprecedented opportunity born from the chaos of post-war immigration policy and the compelling nature of their specific story. The news spread through military channels and then to civilian communities faster than anyone anticipated. The story of 12 German child soldiers who had expected execution but received root beer floats instead captured public imagination in a way that transcended typical wartime narratives. Newspapers picked up the story, initially from reports by soldiers who had witnessed the surrender, and then through Mrs. Hartley's carefully crafted appeals to humanitarian organizations. The narrative combined elements that Americans found compelling. Innocent children betrayed by evil leadership, acts of mercy by American soldiers, and the possibility of redemption through kindness rather than vengeance. Applications from potential sponsors began arriving within days of the program's announcement. Farm families in Iowa and Wisconsin saw opportunities to gain helpful workers while offering stable homes to displaced boys. Urban families in cities like Boston, Chicago, and Milwaukee were moved by humanitarian impulses and wanted to participate in what they saw as a uniquely American act of generosity. Some applicants were motivated by religious conviction, viewing sponsorship as a moral obligation to help children who had suffered through no fault of their own. Others were immigrants themselves, or children of immigrants who understood what it meant to build new lives in a foreign country. Sergeant O'Brien's own family in Milwaukee submitted an application to sponsor Friedrich, the red-haired orphan who had reminded Private Chen so much of his cousin. O'Brien's sister, mother to those twins whose photographs he carried, Omaisari had been reading her brother's letters about the German boys and felt compelled to act. Private Martinez inquired about sponsoring Joseph, having formed a bond with the youngest boy that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. The arrival of sponsorship applications forced each boy to make the most significant decision of his young life. Mrs. Hartley spread the papers across the camp's makeshift table, and Klaus helped translate the details for those whose English was still developing. The applications represented real families offering real homes, But accepting them meant choosing to leave Germany permanently, to abandon any hope of reuniting with family members who might still be alive, and to embrace an uncertain future in a country that had been their enemy just months earlier. The weight of such a choice was almost unbearable for children who should have been worrying about schoolwork and friendships rather than making life-altering decisions about nationality and identity. Klaus faced the most agonizing choice. His mother and sisters were alive, confirmed to be living in the displaced persons camp near Stuttgart. They were waiting for him, expecting him to return and help rebuild their lives from the devastation. He had written letters to them, carefully worded descriptions of his capture and treatment that tried to explain why he wasn't rushing back to them immediately. His mother's responses were loving but confused, unable to understand why her son would consider staying with the Americans instead of coming home where he belonged. The guilt Klaus felt was crushing, a physical weight that made breathing difficult when he thought about disappointing his family. But Klaus had also discovered something in his weeks with the Americans that he had never experienced in Germany: the possibility of education beyond what his social class would have allowed, conversations about ideas rather than just orders and propaganda, and a future that wasn't predetermined by his father's occupation or his family's status. Sergeant O'Brien had been teaching him about American universities, about how veterans were going to receive educational benefits that would allow them to attend college regardless of their backgrounds. Klaus dreamed of studying engineering or languages, of becoming someone beyond what Nazi Germany would have permitted a farmer's son to aspire toward. Friedrich's decision was simpler in some ways, but no less profound. He had no family waiting in Germany, no home to return to, nothing but memories of parents who were dead and a city that was rubble. The application from O'Brien's family in Milwaukee represented more than just a place to live. It represented belonging, the possibility of having a family again, of being someone's son, even if not by blood. He accepted immediately, then spent 3 days terrified that something would go wrong and the opportunity would disappear like smoke. Private Chen helped him write a letter to O'Brien's sister, careful English sentences that tried to express gratitude while not presuming too much. Wilhelm ultimately chose repatriation, deciding that he needed to search for his grandmother, even if the odds of finding her alive were slim. He couldn't abandon her without knowing for certain what had happened, couldn't build a new life in America while wondering if she was alone and suffering somewhere in the ruins of Munich. The morning of August 15, 1945, arrived with a mixture of anticipation and heartbreak that permeated the entire camp. 7 of the 12 German boys had accepted sponsorship offers and would be traveling to America within the week. 5 had chosen repatriation, including Wilhelm, who remained determined to search for his grandmother, and Klaus, who ultimately could not abandon his mother and sisters despite his dreams of American education. The division of the group felt like tearing apart a family that had formed under the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. They had survived together, transformed together, and now they would face their futures separately. The American soldiers who had become surrogate family to these boys struggled with their own complicated emotions. Sergeant O'Brien had grown particularly close to Klaus, seeing in the intelligent 16-year-old a younger version of himself, someone capable of great things if given the opportunity. He spent their final evening together talking about the future, encouraging Klaus to pursue education in Germany, reminding him that rebuilding his country was noble work that required good men with vision. Klaus listened with tears streaming down his face, understanding that O'Brien was trying to make him feel better about a decision that felt like giving up on his dreams. Private Martinez had been working behind the scenes to expedite Joseph's sponsorship paperwork, calling in favors and navigating bureaucracy with single-minded determination. The 12-year-old boy who had arrived with a fever and an infected leg wound had become like a son to him. Martinez had no children of his own, wasn't even married. But he knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to raise this child, to give him the safety and love that war had stolen from him. The paperwork finally came through 3 days before their scheduled departure, and Martinez held Joseph while the boy cried with relief and residual fear that something might still go wrong. Friedrich packed his few belongings with trembling hands, still unable to believe that he was going to have a real family again. O'Brien's sister had sent photographs of his future home, of the twins who would become his brothers, of the small room that would be his own space. The red-haired orphan who had been living on the streets of Frankfurt before his conscription kept touching these photographs as if they might disappear, proof that his new life was real and waiting for him. Private Chen helped him practice English phrases he would need, teaching him how to introduce himself to his new family with confidence rather than the subservient gratitude of a refugee. Otto was being sponsored by a farming family in Iowa who had lost their own son at Normandy. They had read about the German boys and seen in Otto's carpentry skills and farming background someone who could help work their land while honoring their son's memory through an act of mercy he might have approved of. Hans would be going to a German-American family in Pennsylvania who had maintained connections to their heritage while embracing American values. The family patriarch was a professor who believed in rehabilitation through education and wanted to mentor a former Hitler Youth member toward better understanding. The transition to American life proved both easier and harder than any of the boys had anticipated. Friedrich arrived in Milwaukee on a sweltering August afternoon and was immediately engulfed by O'Brien's family with a warmth that was overwhelming after years of war and loss. The twins, Bobby and Danny, treated him like the big brother they had always wanted, following him everywhere and peppering him with questions about Germany that he struggled to answer without revealing the full horror of what he had experienced. O'Brien's sister, Margaret, gave him space to adjust while making clear that he was family now, not a guest or a charity case. She enrolled him in high school for the fall semester, bought him new clothes, and never once made him feel like his presence was a burden. Joseph's adjustment was complicated by nightmares that woke him screaming several times a week. Martinez, who had left the army to focus on raising his adopted son, sat with him through those dark hours, speaking softly about safety and permanence until Joseph could breathe normally again. They lived in a small apartment in Los Angeles, and Martinez worked as a civilian medic while Joseph attended elementary school. The boy's English improved rapidly, but he carried a wariness that teachers noticed, a tendency to flinch at loud noises, and to hoard food in his desk as if fearing he might starve again. Martinez worked patiently with school counselors to help Joseph understand that his trauma was normal, that healing would take time, that having scars didn't mean being broken. Otto thrived on the Iowa farm in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The physical labor reminded him of home, but without the fear and violence that had permeated his final months in Germany. The family who sponsored him, the Hendersons, treated him with firm kindness, expecting hard work but offering genuine affection in return. Their lost son's bedroom became his space, filled with another boy's trophies and books, and Otto spent the first month feeling like an intruder. But gradually, as Mr. Henderson taught him about American farming techniques, and Mrs. Henderson insisted he call her by her first name, Sarah, he began to feel like he belonged there. He wrote letters to Klaus describing his new life with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. Hans faced perhaps the most challenging adjustment because his sponsoring family, the Vogels, explicitly wanted to help him deprogram from Nazi indoctrination. Professor Vogel assigned him books about philosophy, history, and political theory, then engaged him in long discussions that challenged everything Hans had been taught. The process was painful, requiring Hans to confront his own complicity in a system he had enthusiastically supported. But Professor Vogel was patient and never cruel, helping Hans understand that being indoctrinated as a child didn't make him evil, but that he had a moral obligation to think critically about ideology for the rest of his life. Hans enrolled in public school and was startled by the diversity of his classmates, by the casual friendships between students of different backgrounds that would have been impossible in Nazi Germany. 25 years after those 12 German boys emerged from a Bavarian forest expecting execution, a reunion was organized in Milwaukee that brought together both those who had stayed in America and those who had returned to Germany. The event was covered by local newspapers and drew significant public interest as a symbol of post-war reconciliation and the power of individual mercy to transcend national hatred. Friedrich, now a mechanical engineer with his own firm, had coordinated the gathering with help from Klaus, who had become a translator for the West German government and was visiting the United States on official business. The years had transformed these former child soldiers into accomplished men, but the bonds formed during those crucial weeks in 1945 remained powerful. Joseph arrived with Martinez, who was now 63 years old and still as protective of his adopted son as he had been when Joseph was 12. Joseph had become a pediatrician, dedicating his life to caring for children in a direct response to the care he had received when he needed it most. He still kept the diary Martinez had given him during those early difficult months in Los Angeles, filled with drawings and words that documented his journey from traumatized war orphan to confident American physician. Otto brought Sarah Henderson, his sponsor mother, who had insisted he stop calling her Mrs. Henderson within his first year on the farm. She was elderly now, but still sharp, and she told anyone who would listen about how Otto had revitalized their farm with innovations and hard work. Otto had married a local girl, raised 4 children on that Iowa farm, and never forgot that an act of mercy had given him the life he now enjoyed. Hans had become a professor himself, teaching political science at a Pennsylvania university and specializing in the study of authoritarianism and propaganda. His sponsor, the elder Professor Vogel, had passed away 5 years earlier, but Hans credited him with saving his life by teaching him how to think rather than simply what to think. He had written books about his experience in the Hitler Youth and his subsequent deprogramming, becoming a voice for understanding how ordinary people could be manipulated by totalitarian systems. Klaus brought photographs of his family in Germany, showing his successful career and the rebuilt family farm that he and his sisters had restored from wartime devastation. He had maintained correspondence with all the boys throughout the years, serving as a bridge between those who stayed in America and those who returned to Germany. He spoke emotionally about how his brief time with American soldiers had shaped his understanding of democracy and human dignity. The reunion lasted 3 days, filled with stories, laughter, tears, and profound gratitude for Sergeant O'Brien, who attended with his own grandchildren. Now retired and graying, he listened to these successful men talk about that May morning in 1945 when they emerged from the forest as terrified children and encountered Americans who chose mercy over vengeance. They raised glasses of root beer in his memory of Wilhelm and in celebration of the simple gesture that had demonstrated that even in war's darkest moments, humanity could triumph over hatred if people chose to let it.